Part 2. Calculating the meaning of what the number 6 stands for to mean by itself. Now, in order to understand what the number 6 represents alone, we're going to go to a couple scriptures. But the first scripture I'm going to read is Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, which speaks about how the wise and insighted spiritual person should calculate the number of the beast. Before it even mentions the number of the beast, it says at Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, this is where it calls for wisdom. Let the one who has insight calculate the number of the wild beast. I'm going to pause it for a second there. So before it even mentions the number of the wild beast, it says for the wise and insighted one to calculate it. So anybody can read the number of the beast. Not everybody's calculating it in order to really understand the symbolic meaning of the number of the beast. So I'm going to read it again. This is where it calls for wisdom. Let the one who has insight calculate the number of the wild beast. For it is a man's number, and its number is 666. So before it reveals the number is 666, it reveals that the number 666 is going to be revealed for the purpose of the incited one to calculate it. So if you're not an incited one and you're not calculating the meaning of the number of the wild beast, you wouldn't understand it. You just, like anybody else, a person would just read, oh, it says 666. Yes, I understand it says 666, but did you calculate the meaning of 666? Did you calculate the number of the wild beast? Or are you just saying it says 666? So it's important to calculate the number in order to get the meaning of what is 666 meaning. Now in part 1, I went over why 666 is repeated 3 different times, which was for emphasis of something. And I use different Bible verses to point out how angels does the same thing. Now this video is for understanding what is the purpose of, what is the symbolic meaning of 6 alone? What does it mean? So in order to understand what 6 means, a part of calculating to see what 6 means, we're going to first learn what does the number 7 represents, because this is part of how the wise calculate the number of the beast. So we see that as 666 3 times. We know why to say it 3 times for emphasis. Let's see what the meaning of the 6 alone stand for. Because if we find the meaning of the number 6 and what it stands for alone, then we can understand what is emphasized 3 different times. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. That's Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. Where it says, On the seventh day, God finished his work he had done. So, on the seventh day, God rested from all his work. So, what is it saying about seven? What does seven mean? How is seven being used in this instance? Well, we can see that seven is used to represent how God had finished all of his work. So, seven represents completeness in this sense, in this Bible scripture. Let's go to another Bible scripture that backs up this same point. Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. That's Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, where it says, Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because he rested from all his work of creation he had done. And also, I'm going to say end quote. And so from here, in this Bible verse, we can see that seven again is glorified as being representing completeness. Another scripture that backs up this same point is Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Again, that's Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. That backs up this same point. And they all point out how seven is used for completeness of creation. And God even marked it seven as holy. The second point we're going to go to is under the subject, seven is used for completeness of a week. So the first part we was on was seven was used for completeness of creation. Seven on this second point is pointing out how seven is used to show completeness of a week. The scriptures are, I'm just going to say the scriptures, and you can look them up later and pause and look them up. The first scripture is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 10. That's Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 10. The next scripture is Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. Again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. The next scripture is at Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3. Again, that's Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3. And all of these different Bible points, these three different Bible points out how the number 7 is used to signify completeness of a whole week. The next point, the third emphasis point of how 7 is used for completeness is how 7, the seventh day, is glorified. Now, I know at Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, it speaks about how God made the seventh day a holy day. And he glorified it. So this is also going to back up that point. So I'm going to tell you the Bible scriptures on that. The first one is Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. That's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. The next scripture is Leviticus chapter 26, verse 2. Again, that's Leviticus chapter 26, verse 2. The next scripture is Exodus chapter 31, verse 15. Again, that's Exodus chapter 31, verse 15. And the last scripture is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 10. Again, that's Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 10.